Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack. Here today for a discussion about serverless architectures. Joining us are Kyle MacDonald of the New Stack and a colleague here who we work with on a daily basis. Hey, Kyle.
Alex, it's great.
And Kapil Thangavelu. Hey, Kapil, how are you?
Great, Alex. Glad to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. And Kapil is with Capital One and is a developer there. And we just wanted to sit down for half hour or so and talk about serverless. And you seem to have some knowledge of the space and thought it might be a fun conversation. So why don't we just get started? I would love to just start off by getting your context about the serverless market. What is it that you have found about the serverless market that provides context for you as a developer at Capital One?
So I just got back from the serverless conference in the UK, and we had a couple hundred developers there talking broadly about some of their experiences at both startups and enterprises. It's clear that the serverless paradigm has struck a nerve across technology organizations, and it's very much a nascent thing. It's transformative both in sort of how it enables 100% utilization, which is a game changer from a cost perspective, and how it enables real-time event-driven systems for data processing and applications. Both of those are truly game changing, I would say, in the sense of enabling entirely new business models on top of serverless. Sort of looking at the general enterprise space, I see a couple of different initial utilizations of serverless. I think we're still very much at the fore. This is very much a rapidly evolving equation. We have a couple different platforms that are offering serverless services, but the tooling is sort of immature, and that's rapidly evolving. So looking at some of the enterprises data use cases that we see in sort of on the initial adoption curve, you see the sort of data processing uses. You see sort of some automated DevOps usages and some utility computing. There's a couple things that hold the enterprise back from sort of going full-fledged, and you also see some of the API usages using Amazon's API gateway and Lambdas to deliver applications with much greater utilization and less waste. But looking at some of the issues, the reason why these points become very interesting on the data processing side, you see Lambda usage with Kinesis for sort of real-time data processing. You see sort of movement within object storage to construct workflows and pipelines around how content pipelines and transformation pipelines. And on the DevOps side, you might see sort of hiding provisioning behind some of these serverless functions, Lambda functions, to use Amazon's technology that can enable teams to move faster. Some of the issues that I see that are sort of preventing some of the broader adoption and more widespread that you see in some of the startup lands, that's sort of hurting the enterprise with regards to the platform itself is potentially the lack of PCIe certification for some of these serverless implementations. And then some of the issues around cost accounting. In the enterprise, you have lots of different developers building lots of different apps. And one of the issues currently around the Lambda implementation of serverless is that it doesn't really reflect, doesn't allow for chargeback models to the applications. So it requires sort of looking at structuring the infrastructure differently to take advantage of for that purpose. And then, of course, the audit is sort of a key aspect, which is also typically within an Amazon space, you would use CloudTrail for your audit log of who's doing what in the account or using which APIs. And unfortunately, the serverless, the Lambda implementation has some significant deficiencies there. And looking more broadly at some of the other providers in the space, they've been fast following. These platforms represent significant amounts of lock-in to the underlying cloud providers. They integrate well with the hosting of the services there. They're very much the glue factor between the different services at a cloud provider. And that leads to a lot of sort of locking capabilities. Microsoft and Google have been fast followers in the space, sort of announcing their first offerings earlier this year. There's still sort of an immaturity question. We've seen sort of the framework tooling evolve from frameworks that were doing basic provisioning last year to sort of things that are looking at more composition and more discovery components, aggregation frameworks, so to speak, for serverless to encompass the entire stack. And that's been interesting as sort of we evolve up the tier, but there's still a lot of immaturity around that space. But looking at larger enterprises, the premise and value chain is clear around both cost reduction as well as this 100% utilization. And that's really, I think, what drives both the startups and the enterprises to it.
Interesting. I'd like to ask a question about the utilization and the event-driven architectures, what you're talking about. Those seem to be two major transformative aspects of the serverless space right now. Can you? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask about that 100% utilization, in particular. How is that transformative? Take us through that, example of the value of it in terms of its 100% utilization. How does that compare to the more traditional, models that you've had to depend on?
Sure. So, if we look at more general trends in the industry, we have sort of this movement towards microservices and containers, all of which is sort of driving smaller components for increased developer productivity. And sort of serverless are, as some like to call it, functions as a service, allows for that same decomposition of logic into these smaller, independently reusable units. The delta ends up being that as you go into this microservices world, you end up having to provision a lot more stuff. The provisioning and the complexity of the infrastructure gets higher and heavier. You have to have service discovery components. You have to have various orchestration techniques. And serverless ends up simplifying that while giving you the benefit of the microservices. It encompasses microservices, doesn't come with the same amount of baggage. And part of, driving away.
What baggage does it not bring with it?
Well, I don't necessarily have to set up Docker on 1,000 nodes and deal with any of the bugs on an orchestration container runtime, whatever that may be. There's many out there, but the operations around that, it takes time and to productionize a service, be it Mesos or Swarm or Nomad or Kubernetes. There's a learning curve there, and some of that can be sort of bypassed just by in the serverless world, just because it's effectively a managed platform. And you can get straight to sort of building out your business application and business logic as opposed to focusing on the infrastructure tooling.
Is there an element of this? We look, if we go back 2 or 3 years, we used to talk about VM sprawl, right? When we thought about virtualization and when companies first moved to virtualization. Is there something different here with the idea that, an event-driven architecture with, sort of decomposed, having everything be decomposed into either, functions or sort of Lambda events, that you don't have to really worry about the problems of VM sprawl because it's only being executed as it actually needs to be executed. These things aren't always running, and that changes the economics and sort of dynamics of that. Is that?
Absolutely. So coming back to sort of the cost equation and utilization, having code that is only functional as it's being used is what drives that event-based system, drives that 100% utilization. You are paying for exactly the amount of data you're processing. Mm. Typical architecture, you're going to provision on a cluster or a set of nodes, and they might sit at 5% utilization, 10% utilization. That represents 10x 20x cost factors that you're paying for as overhead that you don't need. And so that very much drive, and serverless is relatively cheap, both on the utilization, but also on the actual amount of data, the actual data cost processing. And obviously there's exceptions around some big data frameworks, which are things that are running effectively at 100% utilization. They aren't necessarily good fits for serverless, but some of the application workloads, as well as some of the data processing workloads that are much more sort of record or event driven, can have extreme value capture with serverless technologies.
And so, you've had a chance to sort of talk to a lot of people. I see you out in the community. You just got done talking in London at the Serverless conference. In terms of when you look at companies who are now doing this, sort of in the serverless space or starting to actually put it to work, how is it, how are you managing that? I mean, the amount of artifacts that come when you start to decompose things into functions, how are you managing that growth? Have we seen we're changing the problem set, right? When we were talking about VM sprawl, it was how do you manage a bunch of operating VMs and the VM images and that sort of thing. When we think about it in a functions and sort of serverless world, there's now a lot more code element artifact just in terms of quantity, right? And those are, very large quantities as you grow an application. Is that a new problem area? Is that, is this a concern for the paranoid and crazy?
It's absolutely a concern. I mean, we've traded off one set of problems and moved higher up the stack, and now we have a different set of management problems. And it's very much a space where sort of tooling is still emerging, and where providers are coming up with new capabilities, or people or the ecosystem is inventing them. And last year when I looked at various frameworks for serverless technologies, they were basically focused on sort of basic provisioning an individual function. And now we're sort of moving up the stack where we're seeing sort of frameworks that manage entire APIs composed of hundreds of functions. But it's still very much an emerging space. I've written one for myself around some of our serverless usage as far as doing account level resource fleet management of resources in a cloud provider. But they're both the serverless framework, the Zappa framework. This is very much sort of an emerging technology space where that problem I don't think has a sort of definitive go-to solution for a lot of companies. That it's really sort of finding what works for them and sort of taking abreast of where the community evolves to.
Yeah,
go ahead, Kyle. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so I look at this and when I talk to enterprises, you talk to enterprises, right? We're all sort of looking at how this is being implemented. We talked about 100% utilization. That's definitely got to get the attention of some CIOs and hopefully some CFOs sitting in the room. From a developer standpoint, when you think about the CIOs and sort of some of the executive management you're talking to in some of these enterprises, or maybe it's supposed to, is it the 100% utilization that's perhaps the most interesting to them about serverless? Is it the new design patterns they can sort of get from it? Is it the idea of decomposing things and sort of having the chance to think of it as sort of unique, independent, kind of the microservices approach? What drive, what's...
I think both at the top of the line and at the bottom of the line, at the CIO level and at the developer level, there's sort of I think the driving factors are the same. Developer productivity, being able to take advantage of something which is relatively simple, relatively easy, is operationally simple, easy to develop, operationally simple to maintain, as well as the cost factor. Both of those enable businesses to move faster, and that appeals at the top and the bottom.
And when you serverless, sort of from an enterprise context, is a little bit of a new thing, right? And we're sort of starting to consume it on Lambda, and some of the other clouds now are very fast following. We're seeing it, sort of grow into private and on-prem, in various circumstances. How do you think the ecosystem starts to form around this, right? This has, you talked about 100% utilization. That has dramatic impact for companies, like VMware, right? Where and Microsoft, where server, being able to get the maximum utilization out of the enterprise servers has been, the theme of the last 10 years, right? Serverless introduced, that theme is a very different theme in serverless. So how do you see that ecosystem growing around that, right? How do those companies, do they get it? Do they see that opportunity?
It's unclear. I mean, so that spectrum of evolution over the last 10 years has gone from, bare metal to VMs, to clouds, to containers, to passes, and
back to bare metal.
And then in some cases back to bare metal. And the movement to serverless and where those other players stay is sort of an open-ended question. You see some players like IBM pursuing, OpenWhisk as far as a serverless framework for the on-prem clients. You have other providers like Iron.io that provide similar services. But then you look at groups like VMware, which are very much still focusing on the past world. And you continue to see continued adoption around Docker. One of the challenges is sort of how do you rethink some of the problem set? It's because serverless engenders a different pattern of developing, let's say, than doing so in a pure container world.
Right.
And so that requires some sort of rethinking, but the benefits are clear. And I think there's still, things aren't, we're not going to switch out our legacy apps to serverless overnight. So there is a long tail there, but the question is how do they evolve in this new future?
Yeah, and I think one of the things you were mentioning before is what I'm curious about is all the other uses for serverless. So, and this to me gets to the heart of the question about what's the effect on the organization, right? So, you talked about data processing, automating DevOps, utility computing, and API usages. What are the impacts of those different benefits of serverless computing on the overall organization when you think about the overall 100% utilization that you get out of serverless?
So I think the overall simplicity towards the operations is transformative. They're sort of serverless doesn't mean no ops, and there's still a focus on getting operations there. But having that common platform means organizations have to get to focus on building out their infrastructure, their business applications, rather than focusing on infrastructure. And within the enterprises, you might see, even on a common cloud provider, you might see a significant amount of snowflaking on infrastructure provisioning and management. And having that common base platform that is open-ended to many different services, to many different application uses, really creates a lot of sort of forward momentum on productivity, because the teams are now focusing on their core logic and a framework that gives them both operational simplicity, but a lot of flexibility and speed from both on the application side as far as their integrations. And that's one of the key factors, I think, in looking at serverless. It is, Amazon's embraced it as very much a glue between all of their services, between, DynamoDB and Kinesis and all their family of services. And those connection points are really what gives these platforms their power, is being able to subscribe to data events from your storage systems to be able to process those in real time. In some cases, you don't necessarily have direct analogs in a non-serverless world. Some of the compliance or like in Amazon, there's a facility called CloudWatch Events, which allows us to sort of impose our own business semantics and business rules on top of the AWS API in real time. And that's sort of an integration that if you try to do it without serverless, it would be very hard to do. It's not directly something that you can map to a server-based framework without significant effort. So I think enabling these new applications and these operational simplicity and these cost savings is what's going to take us forward. And on the provider side, it's a question of what they offer as far as the integrations with these event streams. That's going to drive the future of that.
So you've, I've had the chance to work with you for a number of years. You've been a leader in the industry with your work at Canonical around Juju and sort of thinking about how to deploy and do large applications. So you've seen kind of a little bit of the evolution of sort of how we ended up here in the cloud world, both on private and public, and how, with your experience doing Juju and some of the other work you've done, you've seen how people are deploying those applications and really getting them up on the cloud. Based on that, and based on sort of what you've seen around serverless and sort of how fast the serverless ecosystem has sort of coalesced in the last couple of years, these sort of efforts, what do you think the next 2 years sort of look like? What are the kind of next big things that you as a developer would really like to see sort of show up in the ecosystem that you think could do, what takes it to the next level for you? And, based on some of your historical context, what looks different now?
Yeah, so before I come to that question, I did want to touch once more on sort of thinking about the enterprise adoption of serverless and where we get some of the benefits. Because that notion of being stateless and event driven is really helpful, and in some sense for the enterprises, it's sort of the ability to get out of their own way with regards to some of the activities that they have to enforce from a business sense. Being able to sort of strip away that to get to the pure computing facilities is really quite enabling and empowering. Looking to the future of serverless, though, and what I can, crystal ball out, who knows, but we'll see. I see a lot of composition in sort of serverless has these natural analogs to microservices. And so this ability to get better composition tooling and better sort of discovery what's in the serverless stuff. When I presented last week at Serverless Conf, I had one slide as a call out for things, a wish list of features. And some of it's about better tooling, better introspectability, better cost accounting, better auditability, but that's sort of on the sort of core side. Mm-hmm. Going beyond that, it's going to be moving to how do we deploy this set of functions in a way that is a reasonable component within a larger system, and that is addressable and discoverable.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I can think that's one of the questions I wanted to get to was about that tooling and the cost auditing, and what are some of the deficiencies there that you're seeing? I mean, I know that people think of serverless. There's been the stereotype of serverless architectures is like, oh yeah, it's like just really simple stuff. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of complexities. For instance, with the API integrations, for example, and making sure everything is working accordingly. So I'm curious on your, what are some of those deficiencies you see in the tooling and the cost auditing, and other examples?
Yeah, in some sense, users of these platforms are dependent on the platform providers to solve some of these needs. With regards to basic things around accounting, auditability, and we have to work with our partners to and these platform providers to be able to enable those. For the things that are sort of above the line, it's really a question about the ecosystem and what the ecosystem can develop. In this context, this is very much still the early days of serverless, and there's several dozen frameworks out there that provide various toolings that can help automate sort of a complex API gateway deployment and mapping all the APIs and all these components, and being able to do blue-green deployments as you do a rolling upgrade through your serverless infrastructure. And it was an interesting point. I did say that there's some operational simplicity around serverless, and maybe that isn't quite fair in the sense that I would say at least a third of the talks last week were about operations and how do we do the operations on serverless. There's still very much both that exists both at the platform side as well as the tooling side, and sort of how do you do error aggregation and monitoring on things that live for fractions of a second, and being able to deal with that well is sort of is needed in the ecosystem to help additional adoption of the platforms.
Cool. So, you were saying earlier you weren't sure what, you were looking at a crystal ball. I'm pretty sure every product manager for every serverless platform is going to be listening to this podcast to figure out kind of what enterprises see as sort of future opportunity, or you as a developer who lives in that enterprise world see as kind of a future of serverless. How do you see, the current developer community and sort of, your peer developers embracing serverless? What's the fastest sort of on-ramp to using it? And then, what's the fastest on-ramp you think to sort of getting it more prevalent and more widely adopted? And yeah.
Well, the easiest way is simply saying, Alexa, tell me a joke.
Why did the chicken cross the road halfway?
I mean, we have it in our homes. We have IoT buttons. We have dashes. It is extremely accessible, and it's extremely easy to take, teenagers and teach them how to build some of these things that they can see, that they can build and show their friends and get engaged with technology. From that sense, there's definitely a lot of interesting things that we're seeing being done both on Alexa or on IoT side that is sort of the counterpart to serverless, is how do we engage with it in the real world. And the APIs and the data processing is one side, but there's a whole different world in addition to that, and the enterprises are engaging there. Capital One has a fantastic Alexa app where I can check my balances and pay my bills. And that isn't necessarily a serverless application, but it's a counterpoint to a platform that is serverless enabled.
We've never had Alexa on the show, so that's a first, Kapil, and it's inspiring because we have a pancake robot that we bring around to different events and have pancake breakfast, and it's a 3D pancake printer, and we've been wanting to figure out how to set it up on Alexa and start having an automated pancake pot. So this is inspiring.
Very cool. It was actually a great talk last week by the iRobot people that do the Rimbas on some of their usage of serverless to help power their platform. So there's very much one of the wonderful things about these platforms is that they make things much more approachable to both startups as well as for engaging and learning.
Oh, great. Well, listen, Kapil, so just a little bit about yourself. What's next for you? Where are you going to be speaking? And I'm just curious, when you're out on the road, what are you hearing people ask about? It's an awesome opportunity to be out there and to talking to people all the time. You're one of those people who really gets an opportunity to be on to really be able to hear what's happening, in the community. So where are you going to be speaking next? And what are the kind of things that you're hearing about these days?
Well, next week I will be out not speaking at a Kubernetes conference. And so,
we'll see you there.
And then shortly thereafter, later this month, I'll be at reInvent, where I'll be talking about one of Capital One's open source projects that I've developed called Cloud Custodian, which we use to help manage our accounts and has direct serverless integration. But beyond that, no plans for the rest of the year.
Well, we'd love to have you join our pancake breakfast up at KubeCon if you're there. So
that sounds fantastic.
Come to have a chance to meet our pancake robot.
So, anything of interest that what you're going to be following up on in your conversations, maybe, and like what you're hoping maybe to hear, what you're wanting to learn from other people as you head out on the road over the last part of the year.
I'm very interested at Kubernetes conference. One of the counterpoints to serverless is these things are effectively stateless. But we still have state in our applications, and in all cases, it's not always something that we can directly defer to managed providers. Looking at some of the PET-set capabilities in Kubernetes and some of the stateful stores that can be placed there is sort of the core counterpoint to serverless, and how we can build some of these managed platforms for stateful services as a counterpoint to our stateless serverless components, so that we can have both sides have our cake and eat it too, so to speak.
Excellent. Well, Kapil, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate it. Kyle, thanks for joining me as a co-host on this episode of the New Stack Analyst. Kapil, we'll see you next week at KubeCon and reInvent, and look forward to keeping in touch and having you again on the show. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.